All right, so we are on Pirkei, the 5th chapter, the 2nd Mishnah. And remember, this is the Mishnah with the numbers, starting off with the number 10. So we're talking about the number 10 today. And we're going to talk about two sets of the number 10 that come consecutively. And what's interesting about this is, in both cases, the Torah tells us all 10 of the steps, or all 10 of the generations. So the minute the Torah tells us something, then obviously it's for a reason. And that's what this Mishnah is going to discuss. Why do we have to know this information? In other words, the fact that historically, as we're about to discover, there were 10 generations from Adam until Noach is an interesting historical fact. And historically, there were 10 generations from Noach to Abraham is also an interesting historical fact. The fact that the Torah tells us about those generations. Not only does the Torah tell us there were 10 generations, the Torah tells us the names of all of the individuals who represented each of those generations. And therefore, the legacy from Adam till Noach and from Noach till Abraham means the Torah wants to tell us something. So that's what this Mishnah does. It says, let's find out what the Torah is trying to tell us. So we'll do the Mishnah first in one shot, and then we'll go back and unpack it and perhaps throw out one or two questions just to, stimulate some thinking. So this is how the Mishnah goes. Asara doirois me Adam ad Noach. There were 10 generations from Adam until Noach. And then without asking any questions, the Mishnah just jumps right in and says, Lo hoidia. By telling us this information, the Torah wants to tell us, it wants to inform us, Kamo erech apayim lefonov. How incredibly patient Hashem is. Okay? How incredibly patient Hashem is. Shekol hadoiros hoyu machisin uvoin. Generation after generation came and angered Hashem. Machisin, they angered Hashem. Uboin, and they came again to anger Hashem. Interesting language, don't you think? Machisin uboin. They angered Hashem and then they came. What does that mean? Should it be the other way around? Boin u machisin, surely should say that they came and they angered Hashem. What does it mean? Machisin u boin, they angered and they came. Ad shehevi aleihem esmei hamabul, until eventually Hashem said, that's it, no more, thank you very much. We're now going to crack down. And he brought the waters of the Mabul to destroy all of those people. Okay, that's part 1 of the Mishnah. Part 2 of the Mishnah. Asara doirois me Noach ve'ad Avraham. There were 10 generations from Noach until Avraham. Isn't it amazing that we should be learning this Mishnah at this time of the year? Fits right in, right? Fits perfectly. Okay, so 10 generations from Noach until Avraham. Why do you think? Why do you think we have to know this? Lo hoidia, to show us kama erech apayim lefonov, to show us how patient Hashem is. Shekol hadoiros hoyu machisin uvoyin, because all of those generations also angered Hashem. Ad sheba Avram Avinu v'kibel sechar kulam, until our forefather Avram came and he took all of their reward. Got it? Right, let's see. Let's see what are the questions that we could raise about this particular Mishnah. Anything at all that comes to mind that's worth discussing, that's worth exploring about this Mishnah. Exactly. Okay, so you're starting from the end, but fine. Right? So what are we saying? There were 10 generations who angered Hashem. And Hashem was really patient with them until Avraham Avinu came and took their reward. What reward? They all angered Hashem. What reward is there for people who anger Hashem? That Avraham Avinu took their reward. They have to be doing something right. Okay. Right? Okay, that's one question. What else? Any other questions that come to mind? No? So I already mentioned, right, machisin uboin, that the order seems a little bit strange. Why 10? Why is it that Hashem decided that there should be 10 generations from Adam until Noach and 10 generations from Noach until Avraham? Hashem could have done it in any which way that he wanted. Why 10? Why is that significant to us? Why do we have to know that it's specifically 10 generations? And there are 3 personalities over here. There's the personality of Adam, who's mentioned first, who technically doesn't really feature in this Mishnah. Because the events that the Mishnah speak about didn't happen in Adam's time. The first event happened in Noach's time, the flood, and the other event happens in Avram's time, where Avram takes all of the reward. So who are really the characters of this Mishnah? Noach and Avraham. So now, let's ask ourselves, what makes Noach unique? What makes Avraham unique? More specifically, what do the two of them have in common? Let's actually start the conversation there.
They were both God-fearing.
They were both God-fearing. So was Adam. So was Chanoich. So was Shem. I'm sure we could assemble a list of people who were God-fearing people who lived during those 20 generations. What's unique about Noach that he has in common with Avraham?
Stood up against the crowd.
Exactly. They had the wherewithal, they had the guts to stand up against the crowd. There's a lovely story. The story probably happened in the 1950s or 60s. It was a young boy, and he was due to have his bar mitzvah. And his father, for whatever reason it was, set up a meeting with him and the Lubavitcher Rebbe, this boy, before his bar mitzvah. So he comes along to this meeting, and the Rebbe asks him, amongst other things, he says, are you going to continue your Jewish studies after your bar mitzvah? Right? You know the story, right? We all know the story. You know the story of the guy the rabbi who he had a problem in his shul, that there were mice in the shul? You know that story? There were mice in the shul. He didn't know what to do. How do you get rid of the mice? So he went to ask a senior colleague, another Rav from a big shul. He said, what do you do? We've got mice in the shul. How do you get rid of the mice? So the other rabbi told him, it's really simple. All you got to do is give the mice a bar mitzvah. Because the minute you give them a bar mitzvah, you never see them again. So anyhow, so this kid, so the Rebbe asks him, he says, are you going to continue your Jewish studies after your bar mitzvah? So the kid says, honestly, he says, well, look, where I live, none of the children on my block do any Jewish studies after their bar mitzvah. So, I'm going to do what the kids on my block do. So the Rebbe said to him, have you ever heard of a man called Noah? Ever heard of him? Noah, the flood, the ark. He says, yes, of course. One of the things I learned in my Jewish studies. He says, and have you ever heard of a person called Abraham? He says, yeah, he was one of the people I learned about in my Jewish studies. So the Rebbe says to him, what do you think would have happened to the world if Noach would have done what the kids on his block did? Where do you think the world would be today? And where would the Jews be today if Abraham had done what the kids on his block did? So the kid got that. He thought, that really makes a lot of sense. And he made a pledge right there and then that he would continue his Jewish studies. So what the two have in common, both Noach and Avraham, is the fact that they stood up to what was common. They stood up to what was going on around them. And they didn't just simply accept that because everybody's doing a particular thing, therefore we're going to do it as well. So that's relevant to our conversation, which then raises the next question. If they both stood up against the crowd, against the stream, against the current, and they both did what was right at a time when it was really difficult to do so, how come it is that the Mishnah tells us that Avraham gets reward, kibel schar kulam, Avraham gets the reward of all of those generations who preceded him, and Noach gets nothing? Because the Mishnah just says that Hashem was very tolerant and very patient of all of those generations until Noach's time, and then boom, that's it. Then he wiped them all out. Why doesn't Noach get any reward if they're both the same? Okay, so we're gonna talk about that. Exactly right. There's a great criticism that people have of Noach, that he wasn't involved in outreach. Right? Yes. Have you heard this before? Yes. Noach is accused of not doing enough to encourage the people around him. Now let's analyze that for a second. And we'll come back to the whole conversation, but I just want to analyze that point just for a second. So let's imagine that somebody in the middle of Glen Hazel started to build a massive super yacht. Just imagine if it happened. I'm not going to talk about all the neighborhood WhatsApp groups. You can imagine everybody's going to be saying, "Oh, can you imagine what's this person doing and the noise and this?" And somebody called Cap. That's usually how it always ends, right? Somebody called Cap. So. Besides all of that, Noach, we have no evidence to suggest that Noach lived on the beach. So he built this boat. It probably attracted a little bit of attention, yes? How long did it take? 120 years. Now please remember, Noach was not Jewish. A Jewish guy, we can understand why it would take 120 years. It's really funny because in certain Jewish neighborhoods in New York, they've got the equivalent of their builder's warehouse, the hardware shops over there. So when it comes Sukkot time and everybody comes to get the materials that they need to build a sukkah, they have a sign up that says, we don't have the thingamajig that goes on the whatchamacallit. Because they know already, the Jewish community, and we're not necessarily the most handy bunch. But Noach wasn't Jewish. He didn't have this problem. So what took 120 years to build it?
Opportunity.
Why? Because it was the best outreach thing ever. Can you imagine? You got this project that everybody's talking about, and they came over to him and they asked him, why are you building this boat? And he told them, and he said, because if you don't get your act together, I'm going to need the boat. So who says he didn't reach out to the people around him? Maybe he wasn't as effective as he could have been, but who says he didn't reach out at all? So while it is true, and we do criticize Noach for not being as, so to speak, proactive as he could have been, that wouldn't be enough reason for him to get nothing. Abraham gets schar kulam, he gets everybody's reward, and Noach gets nothing. Okay, so there are a few things that we've got to unpack in the course of this mission. Of course, most importantly, we've got to ask ourselves, why do I need to know this information? The Mishnah is not telling us a nice story about what happened in history. The Mishnah is telling us about ourselves. Torah is from the word hoyra'ah. It's there to teach us lessons in our lives. So what are the lessons in our lives from this Mishnah?
But then Noach did do outreach.
He did do outreach.
Yeah.
Exactly.
120 years.
Exactly. It's a lot of outreach, right? It's a lot. So how come he gets nothing? Noach gets 0. Everybody gets wiped out. Abraham gets everybody's rewards.
But you survived.
Okay, he survived, you're right. But Abraham gets everybody's reward. What did Abraham do that was so spectacular that Noach didn't do?
Succeeded. Abraham succeeded.
Did he succeed?
But he had many comments.
Okay, so the question is, okay, it's a good question. Abraham apparently had greater success than Noach. And not only apparently, he did have greater success than Noach. Is that as simple as to say that Abraham tried harder? That's what we're going to explore in part of this conversation. So, first of all, just a few anecdotal insights, and then we'll really get into the meat of this Mishnah. The anecdotal insights are as follows. Quite a number of the commentaries on this Mishnah say the lesson for us is, look how patient Hashem is. That's the lesson. In other words, when we look around and we say, it's really injustice. Look what goes on in our world. Look at those people. They're so badly behaved. And they just seem to live on and endure and succeed. It's not right. It's not fair. Hashem is patient. Don't think that just because Hashem hasn't responded, that indicates that what they're doing is right. Nor does it indicate that Hashem will never respond. So quite a number of the commentaries say, dafka, that particular point, that this is what it's showing us. We know that Hashem is called Erech Apayim. We know that because Hashem told that to Moshe, that he has a lot of patience, but we don't know the length of that patience. How patient will Hashem be? So therefore, this Mishnah comes along to teach us even up to 10 generations.
Just off the thing, isn't that sort of like Holocaust?
I don't want to get into the Holocaust. That's beyond the scope of this conversation. But the idea of Hashem's patience is relevant to us. Don't lose hope in the fact that there is divine justice just because it's not in the time frame that we would like to see it happen in. In fact, for that reason, I think it's Rabbeinu Yonah, if I'm not mistaken, who says the message over here is belief in Mashiach. Because look, 10 generations, and do you know how long those generations were? Those generations from Adam until Noach were not generations as we know them. There were people who lived over there for hundreds of years. Those generations from the time of Adam until the time of Noach is 1600 years. That was a long period of time. And at the end, Hashem brought about the cleansing of the world that needed to happen. So therefore, don't worry about the fact that maybe it's very long and it seems like Mashiach's never coming. Don't worry, Hashem is patient. We need to be a little bit patient as well. Although at some point you've got to stop being patient too.
Didn't Noah maybe leave a bigger legacy behind than Abraham?
In what way? In what way?
The world, because obviously Abraham and the Jewish nation and the rest of the world, if they were to follow the Noahide laws, they've got a place in.
Okay, great point. It's a great point. So we see that there is a legacy from Noach that affects the entire world on a far broader scale than the legacy of Avraham Avinu. So where's that in this conversation, right? It's a really good point. This conversation seems to be speaking about the impact of these two individuals on their time frame, their generation. And we're not talking over here in this mission about their impact going forward. Okay, it's a really interesting point. Very interesting point. So one thing that we know is, by way of introduction to this chapter, was the identification of what 10 represents, what 7 represents, and what 3 represents. And we said we'd keep coming back to it. So one of the things we identified about the number 10 is that the number 10 always represents a complete system. So the way Hashem designed the world or built the world was using 10 utterances. The way he shaped the Torah is with 10 commandments, etc. So the number 10 is the number that represents the wholesomeness of holiness. Okay? So a really healthy, holy spectrum has 10 points to the spectrum, or 10 elements, like we talk about the 10 powers of the soul, or the 10 spheros that Hashem uses in creation. So 10 is a very whole and healthy number. But everything that exists in the realm of holiness, as the pasuk says, Zeh leumas zeh asa Elokim. Whatever Hashem made in the realm of holiness, he made the equivalent on the opposite end in the realm of the unholy. So if there are 10 grades or 10 steps that a person can experience or that the world can experience in terms of reaching perfection, that implies that there are 10 steps that an individual, a generation, or the world could experience in terms of collapse. So when it says that Hashem is patient, it's not only, I mean, it is true to say that Hashem is patient, that Hashem allows things to go and he waits to see if people will do teshuvah, and he cuts them a lot of slack. But besides that, Hashem waits until somebody hits rock bottom, until it's 10 generations of repeated behaviors, again and again, sinking further and further into the abyss, and only then, when there's no resolution, that's when Hashem steps in, and in the one case destroys everything, and in the other case transfers everything to Avraham Avinu. We need to understand the distinction between the two. But it is very interesting, because there is an opinion on this Mishnah that says, Shekol hadoros hayu machisin uboin, that all of these generations, they angered Hashem, and then they came to anger Hashem. Because it's really an important question over here. Let's assume that somebody lived in the generation of the flood. Let's just assume. Now that's the generation that's going to get wiped out. There are 9 generations before that who are also really bad people, and they don't get wiped out. Is that fair? Why is the final generation the one who gets the clap for everybody else who preceded it? So, Kol Adoris Hayumach Isin, all of these generations angered Hashem. Uboin, and then Hashem reincarnated their souls to come back into the world again to see if this time they'd get it right. And again they didn't get it right. So Uboin, they came again, until eventually the people who were there at the time of the flood were the reincarnated souls of those previous 10 generations, who now would experience the retribution for their behavior. Okay, so that's one of the perspectives on this Mishnah. It's an interesting perspective. But what we're going to do over here is, as I said, we're going to get into the real meat of it.
They weren't Jewish. So
They were not.
connecting non-Jews.
Okay, interesting question. How does reincarnation work? Big topic, beyond the scope of this conversation, but let's suffice to say that there is a lot of literature in Judaism that supports reincarnation outside of the Jewish world. Okay? So we don't have the monopoly on reincarnation. Alright, so now let's get into the meat of what this Mishnah is really telling us. In order to understand what's going on over here, there are a couple of principles that we have to establish, really valuable principles that we have to establish, including, of course, how we translate this story into our own lives. So the first principle that we have to establish is the principle of Adam, Noach, and Avraham. All three of them are mentioned in the Mishnah, and each one of them represents a different phase in the history of the world and the development of the world. So let's analyze those three stages, and with that information we could have a look at what's really going on in this Mishnah. That would be number one. Number two, we have to be willing and ready to accept that different scenarios are dealt with in different ways, and there's a very important reason why that would be. Okay, so different scenarios will be dealt with in different ways. Let's start it with Adam. Okay, so Adam was created, yeah? Adam was created and plonked down in a place called Gan Eden. Now, for one moment, just picture for one moment what it must have been like to live in Gan Eden, and then tell me if you'd like to live there. Is anybody here who would like to live in Gan Eden? Okay, so just if you need any convincing, there are no corrupt government officials, no potholes, no load shedding, no anti-Semitism. It's a pretty decent place to live. We know what happens. We know that Adam and Chava together, they don't exactly respect the rules of the club, so they get bounced out of the club. That's what happens, right? So Adam and Chava are removed from Gan Eden. What happens next? If you look at those next 10 generations, they are treated so well. Think about it. First of all, besides anything else, they live these incredibly long lives. Now that's the first thing that should catch our attention. Why? Why did they live for so long? Why? Did they deserve it? Did they earn it? Were they such amazing, spectacular people that they should have received the gift of living for so long? Well, according to this Mishnah, they were machisinu boin. They were people who consistently angered Hashem. So how's that right? How is it that they continue to live for these incredible periods of time even though they're angering Hashem? What does that tell you about that phase of the development of the world? That piece, that era in history, what does it tell you? Is that the word? Is that the word? Is that the word? Okay, you're pulling it straight out of the Mishnah, right? Patience. Is this a time of rachamim? Is this a time of Hashem's mercy? Is that the word? What's another word? Patience, right? Let's find another word besides patience. Let's find another word.
What's the conceiving opportunities?
Opportunities. What's the word? It's a time of not so much potential. It's a time of not rachamim. It's a time of inspiration. Is a good word. Getting warmer, right? It's a time of inspiration. So it's a time of chesed. Now there's a huge difference between chesed and rachamim. Let's just illustrate for a second what the difference is between chesed and rachamim. A person who spoils their child shows chesed. A person who feels the pain of their child even when they discipline them is rachamim. There's a big difference. Chesed is all about giving. Rachamim is about feeling, empathizing. This is not a period of rachamim. This is a period of chesed. And very specifically, this is a period of divine chesed. So now let's go back to Adam. Did Adam choose to be created? No. Whose idea was it?
Hashem.
It's Hashem's idea. Whose idea was it to create the world? Hashem. Right? 1 second. So whose idea was it to create? How much impact or input did people or any other living beings have in the creation process? How much input? Zero. In other words, this is a period of time where it's one way. It's Hashem's input into the world without the expectation of anything in return. That's why he's so patient. That's why there's Erech HaPayim. Because at this point in time, Hashem is just giving and giving and giving, and it's all okay. He's happy to give.
But if there was no expectation from Adam and Chava, then why were they bounced out of the club?
Good question, right? If there's no expectation from Adam and Chava, why are they then held accountable for having eaten what they shouldn't have eaten? It's a great question. There's a fascinating statement of Chazal that people don't like to hear. And that is that it was all a setup. That it's what we call Noira Alila al Bnei Adam. That there are certain plans that Hashem has, and the way that He decides that those plans are going to play out is to create a situation where we become the catalyst for the plan, and we can then be blamed for it. But it was always the plan. Okay? So the plan was to get us out of Gan Eden. That was the plan. Interesting. Right? So now, what's happening at this point in time? There is a tremendous amount of divine benevolence in the period of Adam. The downside of so much divine benevolence is that it really doesn't allow us an opportunity to grow. Because as long as a person's being given everything on a silver platter, there isn't really that challenge to contribute. Or to put it differently, if somebody's being inspired, raise your hand if you enjoy being, right? If somebody's being inspired, right? What happens when you're being inspired? You have zero sense of what you will look like after the inspiration is over. And that's why we're often disappointed after the inspiration. I don't understand. I was so inspired, right? That's what happens. So for example, in Yom Kippur is a great example. Because you get to the pinnacle of Yom Kippur, you stand there on the Ilah, the whole community screams out together, Shema Yisrael and Hashem Hu Elokim, and you feel like chills up and down your spine. It's amazing. You think, that's it, I've crossed the threshold, I'm now going to be a tzaddik. By next Yom Kippur, I'll never have to say Al Chait ever again. And then you go home and break the fast. And guess what? The Yetzer Hara comes to dinner. How does it work? So the reality of inspiration is that it always carries the danger of what happens when the inspiration pauses. So at that period, that first period, Adam to Noach, Hashem is pumping this absolute love and goodness and kindness and tolerance into the world. Erech Apayim, He lets it go, it's fine, He's patient, but the people don't really grow in any meaningful way. As a result of that, Noach can't even speak to them. He can try, but there's actually nobody to talk to. In other words, if you've ever dealt with somebody who has been indulged their whole life, you can't now explain to them why they should take personal responsibility. It's not part of their vocabulary. So yes, we could be critical of the fact that Noach didn't do more. At the same time, we have to be cognizant of the fact that it was near impossible to be able to do more, because the people were not brought up with a sense of personal responsibility. And if he was now going to demand of them personal responsibility, all he got was blank stares.
So then why would he be held accountable for that? It was Hashem who said to that. He was the one who spoiled them.
You're saying, why should Noach be held accountable for?
For the people not listening and being open to it.
Right, good point. That's absolutely correct. And that's why there's the debate amongst, very famous debate amongst our Chachamim. Was Noach a tzaddik only relative to his generation, or was he truly a tzaddik? So if we go with a view that the people were, impervious to any influence, then he really was a tzaddik. It's only when we go with the other view, that is, he didn't try hard enough, then we say he was a relative tzaddik. So that's how we have these two views. Now the flood is a major, excuse the pun, watershed moment in history. Because what happens at the time of the flood is not just that, okay, out with the old, in with the new. That's how most people understand it, right? Okay, those are the bad guys, we're going to completely destroy them, but then we're going to bring in a new batch of people and they'll be okay. There are more than 1 million ways that Hashem could have gotten rid of the people of the flood. All right, we've just experienced COVID, surely He could have done something. Why was it a flood? And why was it a flood that rained for 40 days and nights specifically? Because the number 40 is very significant for a number of reasons in Judaism. One of the reasons that the number is 40 is significant is because it's the number of purity. The volume of water that a mikveh requires is 40 sa'ah. to destroy the world through water, and specifically with the number 40, is an indicator of the fact that this was not only about destruction, it was a mikveh experience. It's a purification of the world. The world's now going to become a place that is more capable of growth, that doesn't have to only have divine input. It can actually start to find its own way. And you know where we see a great example of this, by the way? Fascinating example of this? What's the sign that Hashem gives Noach after the flood? Rainbow. So you telling me that for the first 1600 years of world history, there were no rainbows? Is that what it means? Because that's what it sounds like. Eskashti nosati be'onon. Now I place my rainbow into the clouds, and that will be v'hoyolo'is bris. That will be the covenant. That sounds like there were no rainbows. Now, a rainbow is a natural phenomenon. You can have a rainbow in your garden when you water with the hose, right? So what does it mean that now there's this rainbow? So currently, Baruch Hashem, Hashem decided that we should be able to have Exhibit A out the window. So if you look out the window today, right now, with a grey cloud out there, is this the correct setup for a rainbow? No, why not? Because in order for a rainbow to occur, you've got to have the clouds starting to thin out so that the rays of the sun can go through the cloud and refract through that moisture to create a rainbow. So the commentaries all ask the question, was there no rainbow before the flood? And many of them answer, no, there wasn't, because the cloud was always too thick. Natural phenomenon. Hashem never allowed the cloud to be that bright or that thin that the sun could shine through and create a rainbow. Now, nothing that happens in the natural world is accidental. It must represent what's happening in the spiritual world. The sun represents godliness. Shemesh umogein Hashem Elokim. That's what the pasuk says, that Hashem is compared to the sun. And the clouds obviously represent a blockage of the sun. So that would represent when the world cannot access godliness. When the world is so thick, then you'll find that Hashem makes the clouds so dense. I'm not saying that that's the case in today's weather, but conceptually, the cloud was always so dense so that the light could never get through, to represent that the world was not yet capable of feeling and experiencing any godliness. It could only live on Hashem's good graces. After the flood is over and the world's been purified, as the Midrash says, when Noach stepped out of the ark, it says, Olam Chadash Ra'ah. He saw that the world was a new world. A new world means now it is possible to actually detect godliness, and you can actually start to expect people to work of their own accord. It's a huge shift from before to after the flood.
Then you have immediately both
Correct?
get drunk and sin and sin.
Correct.
So
Okay, good question.
Why did Hashem start world then? Why do we need that whole process of creating
Good question also.
Why not press play now?
Good question. Well, I have a better question, sorry. Why start then? Why doesn't he start at Matan Torah, where, as we're going to learn, the world will be in a far better place? Right? Why all these steps? Okay? So
was it a planned?
obviously it's planned. Obviously it's planned,
It
right?
seems
So here's the thing. So
Why put somebody into Gan Eden if you know that they're going to fail? Like, if you
no, not if you know they're going to. You don't put somebody into Gan Eden if you know they're going to fail. You put someone into Gan Eden so that they can fail.
So, yeah,
That's the plan, right? It's not because you know they're going to fail. You put them into Gan Eden so that they can fail. That's the plan.
difference between wrong and right.
Who says it's a waste of energy?
No, they learn what's wrong and right. They
But-
need to be honest.
Okay, so there are many, many, many layers to this conversation. I'm going to try and be as succinct as possible. If Hashem wants us to be in a place that is, I'm going to use the word Gan Eden, it's a very generic term, in a place of holiness and apparent godliness, because that's how Gan Eden was. If Hashem wants us to be in that place, there are two ways we could get there. Either he could drop us into that space, parachute us down into Gan Eden and say that's where you are, or he could create a system where we earn the right to be in Gan Eden, which is much more enriching for ourselves. So which one does Hashem want? Does Hashem want the freebies, or does Hashem want us to earn our keep?
Earn our keep.
Option B, right? Okay, so Hashem wants us to earn our keep. Therefore, just like the baby before it's born gets to taste the whole Torah, so that the goal is not external, the goal is actually intrinsic. In the same way, Hashem takes the first human being, and Adam, we're told, incorporated within him all of the neshamas of all people to the end of time. So he puts Adam into Gan Eden. Now it's inherent. Now Gan Eden is part of our reality. Then, if Hashem was to be the one to remove us from Gan Eden, we never have the power to override what Hashem has done. So the only way to get us out of Gan Eden is to let the humans be the ones who make the mistake, because any mistake made by a human can be corrected by a human. That gives us the opportunity for tshuva, so we could get back into that state of Gan Eden, but this time of our own doing. And because of that, that's why we have these phases. Phase 1 of creation is Hashem giving and showering the world to create the goal, in a sense. Then he pulls back and says, right, now you're on your own. That's the second phase. After the flood, now you've got to find that motivation. You've actually got to start to contribute. It's not automatic. Not everybody's going to suddenly be as they should. Straight after the flood, there's already a human error. That's fine. That's exactly what we need. We need people to be able to do what's wrong so that it becomes valuable when they do what is right. But it is only after the flood that human beings are susceptible to actually grow of their own accord. Therefore, the generations from Adam until Noach, there is nothing that they could contribute. There is no reward that Noach could get, because they were not doing anything of their own volition. They were just getting carried along by this wonderful divine inspiration. So there's nothing of value for Noach to collect at the end of the 10 generations. That's why you'll notice that the nature of those, like whatever represents their big sins, like for example the generation of the flood, had a lot of personal human conflict. In a place of conflict, there can never be a good outcome. Whereas after the flood, what's the next big story after the flood? The Tower of Babel, even though it was terribly misguided, Rashi tells us they were not killed because they had unity. That means there is something valuable. In spite of the fact that they're completely misguided and what they did was so wrong, there was a spark of value in it. That value cumulatively over the 10 generations becomes the reward that Avraham Avinu is able to take.
I don't know if I can express this question. I'm trying to get my head around that in the first phase, there was not the opportunity for them to earn back the money.
Right.
It was just divine inspiration that they carried,
Right.
as you said, with the divine presence. But we know that Teshuvah was created before the beginning, the world was created.
Good point.
So where is that opportunity for them in those first 1600 years to have done Teshuvah and have earned it back?
So let's add to your question. Let's add to the question. So you mentioned that Teshuvah predates the world, so surely it had to have been available. But beyond that, Hashem tells Cain directly that he has an opportunity for Teshuvah even after he has killed his brother. And we have, not in Torah Shebechsav, but in Torah Shebal Peh, we have the fact that Adam did Teshuvah for the Chet Tzadas, and that he spent many, many years doing Teshuvah. So that implies that there is the possibility for Teshuvah. There is. Yet, the overarching reality for 99.9% of the population was that wasn't even on the agenda. So we have exceptions, and the concept of Teshuvah will always be available. I'll give another example that maybe illustrates the same point. So we have the principle of, if a person says, Echte va'ashuv, I'll do the Aveira now and I'll do Teshuvah later, so then the Gemara Yuma tells us, Ein maspikin b'yodoi lasos tshuva, that from on high they will never facilitate the opportunity to do tshuva, which sounds to most of us like a dead end. They'll never facilitate the opportunity to do tshuva. But the Gemara does not say they will never do tshuva. It just says, ein maspikin, they won't be given the opportunity. The implication is that if a person really pushed themselves hard enough, they would still be able to do tshuva. That would be that period of history. It's not that tshuva is unavailable, completely suspended. Ein maspikin, the circumstances do not lend themselves to tshuva. Somebody like Adam, who pushes himself to do tshuva, still succeeds in achieving tshuva. Okay? So now what we have is a period in history where there's no value. It can contribute nothing. Those people contributed nothing of value. So the only option is to remove them. And that's indicative of our lives. In our lives, unfortunately, there are some behaviors that never have an upside. There's nothing positive about them. The classic example, as the Rambam writes, would be anger. There is no upside. So therefore, it's not something we should be looking to rehabilitate in our lives. Even though a person will turn around and say, but I've been doing it for so long, 10 generations. In other words, my whole life, I've behaved this particular way. I heard a great word this week. I think, if I'm not mistaken, it's from the Chidushei Harim. Why is it that Hashem tells Avraham Avinu to have a bris at 99 years old? Why? He could have done it at any time. Why 99? To teach us that even at 99 years old, even if your whole life has been one way, you can completely change it. So a person says, 10 generations, I've lived my life always this way. There's no way to change. So the message is, well, there's certain behaviors that have no redeeming factors. So the only way to deal with them is completely remove them. They gotta go. That's what the Rambam says. He says something like arrogance or anger, there is no middle road. You have to go to the opposite extreme. You have to be an extremist about acceptance. As the Gemara says, Hanelovim ve'enom olvim, those who are insulted without insulting back. Or as the Rambam says, that when it comes to arrogance, you've got to go to the opposite extreme. Based on the Mishnah, ma'oid havei shval ruach. You've got to be extremely humble. Certain behaviors cannot be rehabilitated. They are represented by the generations from Adam until Noach. There's no redeeming factor. It's got to go. You've got to bring in a big mikvah, drown it out, and make sure it never resurfaces again. There are other behaviors that are represented by the period from Noach to Avraham. Those behaviors, there's somebody to talk to. Look at Avraham's life. He succeeds in talking to his generation. And he doesn't turn everybody, but he's able to turn some of them. Not only that, in this week's parasha, we're going to see that, in last week's parasha, that Avraham and Sarah go down to Egypt. When they first get there, it's a very unhealthy situation. Avraham's got to protect his life. Sarah gets abducted by the king. And then, before you know it, they turn the whole situation around. And now suddenly Paroi is their friend. And he loads them up with a whole lot of wealth and sends them away in peace. That's representative of the kind of period that Avram introduces into the world. The post-Mabul, the post-Mikvah period. That now you can start to talk to the world. And so if there's a generation that's about to be destroyed, like Sodom and Amorah in this week's parasha, so then Abraham says, but maybe there is a saving grace. Maybe there's a tzaddik in there somewhere. Let's use that tzaddik. And we'll turn the tzaddik into a catalyst to save everybody. Unfortunately for Sodom and Amorah, there was no tzaddik. But principally, this is a time in history where we're now saying the world has potential. And we have a responsibility to find that potential and to use that potential to redefine the world we live in. It's another part of our lives. There's certain behaviors in our lives that are not acceptable according to Torah, but they can be rehabilitated. So let's say, for argument's sake, that you had a person who was an indulgent person, somebody who doesn't know how to control temptation. Is that acceptable? No. Can it be rehabilitated? Yes. And imagine you could get somebody to take their nature of indulgence and change it from indulging in physical pleasures to indulging in the beauty of Torah learning. It would be the same fundamental feeling, totally redirected into a healthy place. Then noitel schar kulam. Then you take all of the benefit and all of the value of what was embedded in that part of the world, and it becomes yours. Noach's job in the world was to preserve that little nucleus of what was good and to allow everything else to be removed. Abraham's job in the world was to be able to engage the world and find the healthy parts of it and bring them on board so that they add value to his journey towards effectively his journey is towards receiving the Torah. So that's a lesson for us. We have to know how to distinguish the parts of our lives that are pre-Noach generation, parts of our lives that have to change, that got to go, versus other parts of our lives that can and should be turned and flipped and rehabilitated into something that adds reward, adds value to our Yiddishkeit. If we could get that balance right, wow, we'd be incredible human beings.
Wow, Stefan.